Hey everyone, and welcome back to RoboCast. It's your host, back again with my trusty AI co-host. Ready to dive headfirst into a topic that I bet we've all pondered at some point.
Yeah.
Is our job just a modern form of slavery?
Right.
We've all had those days where it feels like we're just trading our precious time for money.
Not even enough money sometimes.
And not even enough money sometimes. It's enough to make you want to chuck it all and live off the grid. Okay, maybe not that extreme, but you get the point.
It's definitely a question that's plagued humanity for centuries. You
Yeah.
know, this feeling of being trapped in a system that seems to prioritize profit over people. The truth is, the idea of wage slavery is a concept with deep roots, stretching all the way back to ancient Rome.
Whoa, hold up.
Yeah.
Ancient Rome. You mean to tell me people were griping about their jobs way back when togas were all the rage? I always pictured them lounging around eating grapes
Yeah.
and writing philosophical treatises. Well, some of them were. But even back then, you had brilliant minds wrestling with the nature of work and its impact on the human spirit. Cicero, for instance, argued that jobs reliant on manual labor, lacking any artistic skill, were essentially a form of servitude, with wages serving as a symbol of that subservience.
Yes. Even back then, people felt like cogs in a machine, like their labor was just a means to an end, not something inherently valuable. It's kind of depressing to realize some things never change, but also, it's oddly comforting to know we're not alone in feeling this way.
What's fascinating is how this term, wage slavery, has been wielded throughout history by different groups, often with wildly different agendas. In the 1800s, for example, Southern slave owners actually used it to argue that their slaves had it better than Northern wage workers. Can you believe that?
Seriously, that's like saying, hey, at least you're shackled and forced to work for free. Those poor factory workers have to worry about finding a job and paying rent. That's beyond messed up. How did they even try to justify that logic? Okay, so their argument, and it's a truly twisted one, was that slaves, being considered property, were seen as investments. Because of this, they claimed slave owners were incentivized to ensure their survival, providing them with a basic level of job security, some necessities, even during economic downturns. This, they argued, made them better off than wage workers who were viewed as disposable.
Okay, first of all, let's call this what it is. A horrific attempt to minimize the horrors of chattel slavery, comparing the systematic brutality of owning another human being to the struggles of free people, even those facing exploitation.
Yeah.
It's just plain wrong. I can only imagine how the abolitionists of the time countered this ludicrous argument.
Abolitionists saw right through this fallacy. They argued that unlike enslaved people, wage workers at least had the potential for upward mobility, even self-employment. They pointed to examples like Frederick Douglass, who initially believed that earning a wage made him, and I quote, my own master.
Right, that whole pull yourself up by your bootstraps idea, which, let's be honest, is a lot harder to do when the system is rigged against you. But didn't Douglass later change his stance on this whole wage slavery thing? What caused that shift in thinking?
You're right. He did, Douglass. Like many others, experienced firsthand how the rise of industrialization fundamentally changed the economic landscape. As factories sprang up and mass production took hold, self-employment became increasingly difficult. Traditional crafts were replaced by machines, leaving many skilled artisans with limited options. This made the idea of wage slavery, of being trapped in a system that benefited factory owners at the expense of workers, feel all too real.
It's almost ironic, isn't it? The very forces that were supposed to usher in progress and freedom, things like industrialization and mass production, ended up creating new forms of economic dependency.
That's precisely the point. And this tension, this struggle between the promise of progress and the realities of exploitation, is something we see echoed throughout history. Let's shift gears for a moment and consider the Lowell Mill girls. These were women working in the grueling conditions of early American factories, yet they became powerful advocates for workers' rights.
Oh, yeah. The Lowell Mill girls, they were on the front lines of the labor movement, fighting for fair treatment way back when. I'm curious, did they see themselves as wage slaves, even without the historical context we've been discussing?
That's what's so incredible about the Lowell Mill girls. They independently drew parallels between their own situation and slavery. Despite lacking formal education and political theory, these women understood, on a visceral level, what it meant to be exploited for their labor. They even had a protest song with the powerful lyrics, "Oh, I cannot be a slave. I will not be a slave." It's a testament to the universality of that desire for agency, for control over one's own life and work.
Wow, that gives me chills. Imagine working in those conditions, surrounded by the deafening roar of machinery, and still finding the strength to stand up and sing about freedom. It makes you realize that the fight for workers' rights is not some abstract concept. It's deeply rooted in the human experience. connecting us across time and circumstance. But let's be real for a second. While the exploitation these women faced was undeniable, it wasn't chattel slavery.
Right.
So, are there really valid parallels to be made between their situation and the modern workplace?
That's the million-dollar question. And while we don't have people literally chained to their desks today, there are definitely arguments to be made about the psychological control mechanisms that exist in many modern workplaces.
Psychological control. You've got my attention.
Okay.
What exactly does that look like in today's world? Are we talking about subliminal messages piped through the office speakers? Or maybe those team-building exercises that always feel a little culty?
Think less Manchurian candidate and more subtle forms of pressure. Think constant surveillance. Performance reviews that feel more like personal attacks than constructive feedback. Or jobs that demand you maintain a cheerful facade even when you're feeling utterly burnt out inside.
Oh, you mean like when you work retail and get reprimanded for not smiling brightly enough while cleaning up a customer's mess?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can see how that's not exactly empowering. It's like you're constantly being evaluated, judged, and pressured to conform to these arbitrary standards of behavior, all in the name of productivity.
Precisely. It creates an environment where individuals feel pressured to prioritize their employer's demands, even at the expense of their own well-being. But before we spiral down the rabbit hole of modern workplace anxieties, let's take a step back and consider, how did we get here? How did we go from togas and protest songs to ergonomic chairs and passive-aggressive emails about workplace morale? It's a fascinating and complex evolution, really. Remember how we talked about those Southern slave owners twisting the concept of wage slavery to fit their agenda? Well, understand the different ways that argument has been used and countered helps us trace the path to the modern workplace.
Okay, so let's break it down. What are some of the key arguments for and against the idea of wage slavery today? Because I have a feeling it's a lot more nuanced than just all jobs are bad, or if you don't like it, quit.
You're absolutely right. It's much more nuanced than that. One of the most common arguments against the wage slavery comparison is the idea of choice. Unlike those forced into chattel slavery, workers in a capitalist system technically have the freedom to choose their employer or even start their own business.
Right, that whole if you don't like it, quit mantra. But we all know it's rarely that simple.
Exactly. Critics of that argument point out that this so-called freedom is often an illusion, especially for those in low-wage jobs with limited skills or education. The reality is that many people are trapped in a cycle of economic necessity. They simply can't afford to risk their livelihood by rocking the boat, even if their work conditions are terrible. It becomes a matter of survival.
It's like being stuck between a rock and a hard place. And speaking of being stuck, remember when we talked about that concept of the reserve army of unemployed? How does that factor into this whole discussion?
That's a crucial point. The reserve army of unemployed, a term coined by Karl Marx, refers to that pool of jobless individuals who are always available to fill open positions, often for lower wages. It creates this constant downward pressure on wages and working conditions because employers know they can easily replace dissatisfied workers.
It's almost like an unspoken threat hanging over everyone's heads, right? Be grateful for what you have, or someone else will gladly take your place. That's not exactly a recipe for worker empowerment.
You hit the nail on the head. It creates a power imbalance that makes it incredibly difficult for individual workers to negotiate for better conditions or fair wages. They're often pitted against each other, competing for scraps rather than uniting to demand a larger slice of the pie. And that's where things get really interesting when we start to explore potential solutions.
Okay, so if the system itself is designed in a way that disempowers individual workers, what are the alternatives? We briefly touched on things like worker cooperatives and employee ownership. Are those just pie-in-the-sky ideas, or do they have any real potential to level the playing field?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's one that thinkers and activists have been grappling with for centuries. These alternative models, like worker cooperatives, where employees collectively own and manage the business, are often presented as a more equitable and empowering way to organize work. But the question remains, can these models truly thrive in our cutthroat capitalist world?
It sounds amazing. In theory, more democratic, more equitable. But does it actually work in practice? And what about the impact of technology on all of this? Is automation going to make this entire conversation irrelevant? Will we all be replaced by robots before we can even figure out a better system?
Those are all excellent questions, and ones we'll be diving into when we come back for part 3.
Don't leave us hanging. We've covered so much ground, from ancient Rome to modern-day anxieties. But we're just getting to the good stuff. What can our viewers expect when we return for part 3? Give them a little taste of what's to come. Welcome back to RoboCast, everyone. We're picking up right where we left off, exploring this age-old question of wage slavery, its relevance in our modern world, and most importantly, whether we can create a future of work that doesn't feel like a soul-sucking grind.
And that's the million-dollar question, isn't it, in part two? We were teasing some potential alternatives, like worker cooperatives. Now, while they might sound utopian or idealistic, there's a growing body of evidence suggesting they can be viable even in a competitive market.
Really? So it's not just some hippie fantasy. People are actually making this work in the real world. Give me the details.
Absolutely. We're seeing a resurgence of interest in worker-owned businesses, and not just in niche industries. From grocery stores to tech companies, people are finding innovative ways to share ownership and decision-making power. And the results are promising, often leading to greater job satisfaction, higher wages, and a stronger sense of community among workers.
Okay. That's encouraging.
Yeah.
But what about the elephant in the room, automation? A lot of folks were worried that robots are going to take over all the jobs anyway. So is all this talk about worker empowerment just a moot point?
It's a valid concern. Technological advancements have always disrupted the job market, and there's no doubt that automation will continue to reshape how we work. However, instead of fearing this change, what if we embraced it as an opportunity to rethink our relationship with work altogether?
Rethink our relationship with work. Help me wrap my head around that. What does that even look like in a practical sense?
Imagine a world where automation frees us from the drudgery of those repetitive, soul-crushing tasks, allowing us to focus on more creative, fulfilling, and socially impactful work. Instead of being chained to a desk for 40-plus hours a week, we could have more time for personal pursuits, community engagement, or even starting our own ventures.
That sounds idyllic, almost like a scene out of Star Trek. But let's be real. How do we bridge the gap between point A, where most of us feel stuck in this grind, the point B, this future where work is less about survival and more about personal fulfillment? It feels like a huge leap.
It is a huge leap, and it requires a fundamental shift in our thinking, both individually and collectively. It requires questioning the status quo, demanding better from our employers, supporting policies that promote worker rights and economic justice, and being open to exploring new models of work that prioritize people over profits.
I'm not about waiting for some magical solution to fall from the sky. It's about taking action, pushing for change on multiple fronts.
Exactly. And remember, this isn't about demonizing all employers or dismissing the value of hard work. It's about recognizing that the current system is far from perfect and that it's up to all of us to create a more just and equitable future of work.
Okay, so after this deep dive into the history of wage slavery and its very real implications for us today, what's the key takeaway for our awesome RoboCast viewers?
The key takeaway is this. You are not alone in feeling this tension between the necessity of work and the desire for a fulfilling life. It's a struggle that has spanned centuries, from ancient philosophers to modern-day workers. But by understanding the historical context, questioning assumptions, and being open to exploring alternative models, we can start to envision a future where work is less about wage slavery and more about human flourishing.
And on that inspiring note, it's time to wrap up another thought-provoking episode of RoboCast. Big thanks to Daniel David Allen for having us and letting us explore these fascinating topics with all of you. If you enjoyed this deep dive into wage slavery, be sure to give this video a big thumbs up, hit that subscribe button, and let us know your thoughts in the comments. Have you experienced this feeling of wage slavery? What are your hopes and fears for the future of work? Let's keep this conversation going. Thanks for tuning in.